I wanted to call the regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee to order. It's Monday, June 27th. We have two members, Mr. Koretz, myself, Bernard Parks is chair. Mr. Rosendahl is en route. While he is en route, let me ask Mr. Koretz, could we move number 3 and 5 on consent? Okay, so we'll move those two on consent, so we can start with beginning of the agenda on number 1.
Item number 1 is the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles and City Administrative Officer reports relative to a request to waive the sums incurred by HACLA for payment in lieu of taxes.
Good afternoon, Melissa Fleming with the CAO. The item before you is relative to HACLA's proposed pilot fee waivers. The last time this item was heard in committee, the committee asked the CAO and the CLA to work with HACLA regarding the proposed expenditure plan for the pilot funds. In response to this request, the CAO, through discussion with the CLA and HACLA, has provided a revised set of recommendations relative to the pilot fee waiver. While previous discussions focused on the pilot fees from 2005 through 2011, which total $14.2 million, the revised recommendations contained in the CAO report dated June 24th include a waiver of the pilot fees only from 2005 through 2008. The proposed expenditure plan for the 2005 through 2008 pilot, which totals about $7.8 million, includes $5.2 million in expenditures previously approved by this committee, as well as $2.6 million, which will be used by HACLA to maintain operations associated with the Section 8 Public Assistance Program. It's then recommended that HACLA be instructed to report back to the council relative to the waiver of the 2009 through 2011 pilot, which totals about $6.4 million, and this report back would allow them to provide some additional detail relative to the Jordan Downs project. I'm joined at the table by HACLA, and we're happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. And HACLA is supportive of the recommendations the CAO and CLA have made?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me just ask, because I know it myself, I've heard about the Jordan Down project. I don't have a lot of understanding of it, but kind of give us a very thumbnail of what the plan is, and what I'm most concerned about is whether in the future, if we're talking about environmental cleanup, whether pilot money would be the most appropriate source. And so why don't you just give us a thumbnail? I know I've heard about it read in the paper, but I don't think I've ever...
Yeah, sure. What triggers hopefully successful redevelopment of the Jordan Downs area is the acquisition of a parcel that used to be a cold steel finishing plant. It has a lot of history with a number of different manufacturers. Before we could do anything with that property, we had to take a look and look at the environmental issues. We've done all our borings. The State Department of Toxic Substances has said that we've evaluated enough of the borings and that we can now do a mitigation plan. That's one of the reasons why we suggest we come back into September to reconsider the use of the rest of that money. But that parcel is integral into a goal to maintain 700 public housing units, which is certainly the goal of Congressman Waters, who represents that area, as well as to add another 700 to 800 mixed income housing, so that you can build a community that has a number of amenities that can really change the lives of the people of Jordan Downs. Part of the proposal also is to extend Century Boulevard, and that's one of the first things we're talking about. While we have to have a clean piece of land before you can actually obtain grants for Century. The Century will then continue through all the way to Alameda, which will dramatically change that area. Instead of being isolated, it now becomes very integrated into the whole city, and with potential annexations along Alameda, there is some real chances of that developing commercially and industrial in that area, while providing clean industrial activity.
So the game plan would be that the development would be on both sides of Century?
Yes.
Okay, but the thing is that you're going to be coming back to us with a proposal, but I just asked that you look at whether, I'm not disagreeing with the project, whether pilot is the most appropriate, whether there's other resources for cleanup and whether the state or federal government and people like that who build roads in general, whether they would be the best source to extend Century.
Yeah, we have looked at those, but we'll do our due diligence to make all those clear.
And then let me just ask just a couple of particular questions, is that when we talk about the $500,000 to summer night lights, do we have specific locations and sites that they're going to be held at?
I don't recall whether...
The mayor's office recently released a report relative to the Summer Night Lights program. I believe it's being heard in council on this coming Tuesday, and it provides a great amount of detail relative to what they're spending those funds are. I believe it's on, I don't have it in front of me, I apologize, but I believe it's on some of the associated activities and T-shirts and things like that that they're providing to the students.
Okay. And then also the $1 million on the recreation and park programming. Now that's in addition to services such as maintenance, that also Rec and Park are providing services?
That is for those services. In the budget this current year, there was a discussion relative to $1 million that the general fund was allocating for recreation and parks to provide those services for HACLA. Now this would allow HACLA to simply reimburse those services that were approved in the budget.
But what I'm trying to get is clear, what is service, is that Rec and Park doing maintenance and grass and things, or are they talking actually about?
It's actually the bulk of it is to run these centers where they have the recreational leagues and those types of things, the gyms, the community centers. They have complete scheduling authority in those facilities as well as maintenance. But it's to keep the activities up. That's the primary goal.
Then I'm glad Mr. Rosenthal is here. Were you able to address that one issue he brought up on looking at an additional site in his district in the last meeting? What was that, the additional site?
Talking about the Mar Vista?
Yeah.
Mar
We got Mar
Vista's
Vista, but it was another one he asked you about.
Vera Davis?
The what?
Are we talking about this Vera Davis business?
I think it was, you asked them, they were going to do something at Mar Vista, but you asked them what they looked to add another site as related to summer night lights.
There's some question about...
Well, there were two of them that we
Oakwood
wanted
area.
for summer lights. One is the Oakland, in Oakwood,
Oakland?
in the park, and the other one was Mar Vista Gardens. They're the two.
Mar Vista's in there, and that's clearly our site. Oakwood,
Tell me about Mar Vista, how you're making that work.
well, I think my understanding is the way we're going to do is we're going to go out and subcontract to someone else to provide the services that you identified.
Uh-huh.
So it's $100,000 that's set aside for that. We will actually run that contract.
Okay. And what about Oakwood Park there?
Oakwood, I don't know the details on that because I think I actually deferred to the city because you were asking it to combine in the City Lights program in the city. I don't know whether it qualifies. I really don't know the details.
Yeah. You know the tragedy we just had last week, right? In Mar Vista, in an area that's really part of Venice called Penmar Park. We had killings, 2 young men dead. The community is in tremendous grief, shock, pain, trying to see where we go, what we do next, and that kind of thing. See, there's never been a greater moment of need than right now. So if you come back a little bit more on a summer lights thing for my general area there, especially Oakwood Park, it'd be great.
Let me just ask if we could do this, colleagues, if we could approve the CAO's report of June 24th. Ms. Christian, first of all, you have any questions? Okay. If we can approve the June 24th report by the CAO with his revised recommendations, note and file the June 3rd, June 10th reports, and HACLA's report of June the 6th. But I'd ask, as this moves towards the council, if we could ask HACLA and the CAO to work with the clerk and add a couple of specifics into the committee report, one of which would be what sites are part of the $500,000 expenditure for summer night lights, and then a more clarity as to programming and sites for the Rec and Park expenditure. And then also if you could assess or address whether the Oakwood Park could fit into one or both of those or could become a part of Mar Vista funding, some way that we could address Mr. Rosenthal's concern.
Okay, very good.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move that with those instructions.
Thank you.
Next item.
Next item is item number 2. That's the Community Development Department report and City Administrative Officer and its Chief Legislative Analyst to report relative to an analysis of revenue projections according to the currently approved cost allocation plan, CAP, and with an assessment of general fund reimbursements in the past years.
Good afternoon. This is a very complicated subject, so I'm going to ask you to speak very slow.
I'm Trina Unziker with the Office of the CAO. In a joint report from the CLA and the CAO, we're recommending to use the practice of programming the Cdbg budget, continue moving that forward the way it has been handled in prior years, using the most recent adopted cost allocation plan, which is otherwise known as the CAP, available. Our report discusses some of the questions that have been raised regarding the application of cap rates to Cdbg funds. We're aware that CDD may want to continue the discussion regarding how the cap rates are budgeted, so we are recommending a meeting with our offices, CDD, and the Mayor's office to ensure consistency across departments when budgeting and billing those cap rates. We're also recommending that the CLA and CAO include best practices that might emerge from those discussions in their joint report relative to the program year 38 Cdbg budget, which is the next anticipated budget. We're also recommending that CDD, with the CAO's assistance, prepare a long-term hiring plan that factors in all Cdbg positions, funding sources, vacancies, and potential staffing changes, while maintaining a goal of minimizing general fund support and maintaining balance between eliminating costs and balancing personnel and administrative costs, and that's pursuant to discussions that were held on the budgeting for the city's budget for 11-12. The hiring plan can be referenced when positions are presented to the Managed Hiring Committee on a case-by-case basis. And the CLA and CAO and CDD are available to answer questions that you might have.
Just so I'm clear on it, historically, we had the CAP funds, and we used the year in which the CAP funds were published as a basis of how we applied it to the block grant when it was approved.
Over the last several years, there's been a delay, typically of about 2 years, between the fiscal year that the cap rates are intended for and the preparation of the budgeting process. So both for the city's budget and for the Cdbg budget, what we use in order to budget those funds is the most recent adopted cap rate available. Now, the cap rate...
Stop there so
Sure.
I can clarify. So if we approve the most recently approved cap rate, but as we go through that year and reprogramming, we always use the current cap rate as it is published.
Well,
Don't go back in prior years and say, well, when we approved that document, it was cap rate 30. We go the next year or the following year, depending on how old or what's current at that time.
Well, there are two different ways to approach that. One is if you're talking about some kind of truing up of the actual indirect costs, there's a carry forward adjustment that is provided each time the cap is recalculated. And so the idea is to take into consideration any differences between the fiscal years to which the calculation was applied and the fiscal years that factor in the budget, so that the idea is to always have the most accurate information available to folks who are doing the budgeting, so that we can use that as a good planning document. The other way to look at it is that there's a difference between budgeting and planning those funds and the actual billing. And the billing of the indirect costs is not only affected by the cap rate in place, but also by the actual number of positions. And so departments will not always pay the actual amount that's been budgeted for cap rates, but that could also be as a result of the positions that are available. For example, if a department had 100 budget or 100 positions, and let's say that they have 90 of those filled, and the budget was prepared assuming that all 100 would be filled, just by virtue of the fact that not all positions are filled alone, the department would not meet the budgeting goal. So our idea is to talk with CDD as the administrator and to try to capture best practices in terms of being able to budget on a going forward basis.
So the key is that the larger cap study and report will basically separate the issue of budgeting from billing and give us the best practices in that regard.
As far as Cdbg funds, yes, because I think that there's yet a separate track, and that is an assignment to our office to take a look at non-grant oriented cap rates and how those are applied. I think that would be coming forward under separate cover, but the idea is to capture the actual budgeting and billing practices and bring those forward as a part of the next CDBG budget.
Will the further study of block grant and the long-awaited other report come together?
I see this going in two separate directions because the program year 38 report, I imagine, will come out somewhere between January and February of next year. The larger report, that maybe someone else from our office could speak to, but it's my understanding that it should be coming forward in early fall, late summer.
Is the block grant different in the fact that we have an annual allocation and then we have reprogramming and it goes over a longer period? Is that why it's viewed as being distinct from other types of funding?
It's distinct in part because of the nature of the grant funds. For example, the methodology that we would use internally, department to department, to charge each other, if you will, that's probably subject to a different set of rules. We want to make sure that we're in compliance with all the federal regulations relative to grant funding.
That's the part that I'm most interested in as department to department. As I've said before, I think we should charge the federal government as the appropriate and the highest dollar value to get our full breadth and depth of the grant. But I do have some concerns when we put that same standard on general services who's doing work for Bureau of Engineering or something. I mean, it just seems like that's unreasonable for departments to be using that high level. In fact, it came to our attention recently that we put some 1290 money aside for street services to do some street repair. And before they got started, they came back and wanted to know, could we pay the overhead? And we said, they're already on the budget. Why would we pay you the overhead? And so that's the thing that I think we need to clarify for internal, so that if and I could clearly understand if someone produces a program that then makes a department have to go out and get new personnel, then maybe it would be appropriate. But if they're already on the payroll and this is just a task they're asked to pick up and deal with, I just don't see why we would have a department pay the overhead and related costs because some department is doing the task for another department.
I understand the concern. We'll make sure that that's addressed in the report.
Yeah, this is somewhat confusing, as was noted earlier. One thing I'm not clear on is how is the department doing in terms of being sorted in these positions? Is the department still functional without them? I mean, what's the impact then of being sorted on positions?
I'll defer to CDD to discuss that.
Rhonda Gaston with the Community Development Department. CDD currently has an employment level of 306 positions, of which 270 are filled. We anticipate a few more vacancies arising as the fiscal year ends due to changes that were made to MOU staff are deciding to actually go ahead and retire. So we expect our vacancy count to actually go up. There is some impact in terms of whether or not we have sufficient staff to do the work, but CDD is willing to work with the CAO and CLA to ensure that we can work within the number of staff that we currently have. I think the larger issue for us is ensuring that as we look at the cap rate going forward, we're looking at it not only in terms of the actual impact to the city's general fund, but ensuring that CDD maintains compliance with all of the federal rules and regulations, and we don't exceed the cap or do something that's outside of the regulation.
I know there was some talk at some point about some of the council offices helping a little bit with the budget. Did council offices do that last year? Did any council offices help supplement your budget?
No, I wish they had.
Oh, okay, maybe I'm confused. So that didn't happen. That wasn't part of it.
No, CDD is a primarily grant-funded department. We, until this fiscal year, had a nominal amount of general fund. I think there was $500,000 for our summer youth employment program, of which $50,000 was allotted to CDD for administrative costs. CDD decided not to take the $50,000 this year, and all the money is passed through to community-based organizations. So all of our money is funded outside of the city general fund.
Okay. Councilmember, if I could add, I believe you may be referring to in this round of the budget, there were some council offices that pledged funds towards the summer youth employment program, which is run by the Community Development Department.
I think there's something forward. I think it's CD 15-7.
Mhm.
I can't think of the third one. 3, and then we're going to do something this week. So.
Okay. And that would be beginning July 1? Then, okay.
How much will that help? I assume that's still,
It won't help the department's general operating budget. It will go to actually fund slots for youth to actually be employed during the summer months.
I
So
know
it's-
we were talking about a very substantial cutback, so what percentage will that allow us to reach?
Initially, as budgeted through the city budget process, there was only $450,000 for summer youth, which would get us, I think it was a little over 100 slots, but currently, with all of the money that has been pulled together from the council, from grants and otherwise, we're looking at upwards of $7 million for summer youth this summer, and we should be able to fund over 5,000 slots for summer youth.
Oh, okay, that's pretty good. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
What was the highest? Did we do 15 at one time?
Yes, 15,000.
Then let me ask my final question. On the sense that we pushed for this during the budget year, could we safely say that that the CDD budget is now operating off of the general fund, or the general fund is still supplementing it somewhat?
CDD is off the general fund. We have provided full cost recovery for the last 2 years and expect to do so again this year. However, as grants do diminish at the federal level, as well as CDD's share of Cdbg, when that's discussed at the council level, as that diminishes, CDD would have to change its budget to ensure that we still maintain that level of compliance. And if I can, before I finish, I know the CAO and CLA had recommendations with which CDD actually concurs. There is one issue. We have one staff person in our report that was issued in January. We asked for an exempt position to maintain a staff person so that we could avert layoff. We are still in that scenario, but we would like to work with the CAO and the CLA, as well as the personnel department, to determine how we keep that person employed and they not go off the payroll June 30th.
Yeah, and that request would need to go through the Personnel Committee, so I think if that could just kind of move on that track.
Is that extending an existing position, or are you asking for a new exempt?
We have a staff person that is actually on mayor's office payroll, with the intent that CDD would hire the person in fiscal year 10-11, but because we didn't have the proper position authority, we have just been reimbursing the mayor's office on a quarterly basis for that staff person from our grants, so that there is no impact to the general fund. But assuming that position may not be available in the mayor's office budget anymore and CDD still doesn't have the proper authority, that person would be in a layoff scenario. So we want to make sure we have proper authority to keep that person employed.
And I think it would be appropriate to have that go through the appropriate track so that there is some layoff avoidance, and then maybe perhaps work with the personnel department, CAO, to find a solution for it.
All right. So we'll ask the CDD, CLA, CAO, and what is managed hiring?
I'm not sure this is a managed hiring issue at this point. I think it's more of a personnel issue with regard to the exemption.
So and also personnel department to work on that specific issue. Okay. So we'll move this report, approve the CA, CLA recommendations with that instruction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The last item is item number 4. That's motion Parks Han relative to City Administrative Officer and Chief Legislative Analyst to report with the financial policy that would require that newly funded programs, services et al. provided to the Los Angeles World Airports by the city must be pre-approved by the Federal Aviation Administration.
Good afternoon. I'm Christine E. Hollis with the CLA's office. I'm here with Mark Adams from the Los Angeles World Airports. Last year, in February, Motion Parks Han was introduced, citing some examples whereby FAA ruled that the Department of Airports, or LAWA, had used airport revenue funds for prohibited purposes. your motion asks the CAO and CLA to report to council with a financial policy that would prevent any future misunderstandings, as you put it, of FAA funding guidelines by requiring that any newly funded program that was to involve LAWA funding and a city department be pre-approved by the FAA before any agreement is signed by LAWA and another city department. Subsequently, you also amended this motion, I think it was about a month in May, to include the Harbor Department in the proposed financial policy to be drafted by the CAO and CLA. We did meet. We had some initial discussions with the CAO and CLA had some initial discussions with both LAWA and the Harbor Department representatives and also city attorney representatives. At that time, LAWA was preparing some draft language describing what they actually, what their procedure is already internally in the department. And I'll let Mark Adams continue from there.
Mark, could you incorporate your comments? We've identified two, but other issues in which we've had to retroactively pay back LAWA for the misused the funding.
The two that are identified in the motion are the two that are the biggest ones that anybody who's been following this will know. One is the LA Inc. contract from a number of years ago, not the current LA Inc. contract, but one that was approved a number of years ago, and then the issues involving the 105 freeway right-of-way issues, and whether or not LAWA got suitably reimbursed for the property used for the 105 freeway. LAWA feels it is appropriate that agreements between LAWA and other entities, including the city, are looked at for compliance with the federal revenue regulations, and we already do that at the staff level and at the management level very diligently. The two examples we cited are two that, for one reason or another, were found out of compliance by FAA. The FAA does regularly review many of our agreements, and otherwise were found in compliance. We did meet with the CAO and CLA last year, and we talked about putting together a document that would memorialize what we're already doing at the airport, and we sort of got hung up on the fact of whether or not we wanted to take this document to our board, because we're already these were procedures that are well in place at LAWA. And at this point, I spoke with Gina Marie this morning, and I think we'd be willing to take it to the board now to get that memorialized. It's just a question now as to whether or not, first of all, two questions. One, whether or not what the city wants to do, because just because the Board of Airport Commissioners says an agreement is okay, doesn't obviously the city will want to consider its own policy for independent review. The other thing is that these funding agreements go both ways. There's issues where, for example, where funds should have been coming to LAWA, like with the 105 freeway, or where a city agency is using some sort of city resources, whether it be property or utilities or something like that at the airport, and issues where LAWA funds are going out to another city agency, such as in the case of LA Inc., or when we're contracting for trash pickup with Bureau of Sanitation or something like that. Most of these are very routine agreements, but I think we can work toward getting a policy to our board and to the CAO and CLA that they can then kind of turn into a city policy, if that's
Let me just ask also, on the two items that are mentioned in the motion, did LAWA agree that they met the requirements and later found out they didn't, or how did those come about?
When those were approved, our procedures were perhaps not as stringent as they are now. I think the thought was, again, one was a property transfer to Caltrans for the purpose of the 105 freeway. so that Caltrans could build the 105 freeway. That is so historic at this point. I'm not sure. I can't say what the thought process was in terms of whether or not it complied with the revenue guidelines. As far as the LA Inc. contract goes, it was sort of a splitting hairs issue, because you have the issue of to what extent LA Inc. was marketing on behalf of the airport and what extent they were marketing on behalf of the city. And it was, sort of the division of funds issue. Obviously marketing for the airport was acceptable and marketing for the city wasn't under the FAA guidelines. And so we were able to provide some funds for LA Inc., but not as much as we did.
And I think on the, now, is the LA Inc. contract the same as the job training program?
No, it's not.
Okay, now, the job training never came off.
No, because we actually went to the FAA, because that, as I said, most of the contracts we deal with the city are fairly routine, trash pickup, water and power, that sort of thing. Other contracts, like the jobs program that was proposed under our community benefits agreement, are kind of in the gray area. And for those now, we do take them to the FAA when we think there might be a question. And we did approach the FAA for advice on that jobs training program, and they had some very pointed comments about what sort of things they would allow and what sort of things they wouldn't allow. And
see, that's the one that got my attention. That one, and then the Inc. was that when the plan to how LAX was going to be upgraded, this jobs program became a fundamental part of it as a community benefit. And the question kept being asked by some in council, has this been approved? Can they spend the money in that fashion? And we ended up approving the whatever plan it was, Plan 1 or 1A or whatever, with this community benefit package well in advance of FAA ever looking at it. And what eventually came down was that community people were basically lending their support for a plan, thinking there was going to be some funds being distributed for job training in their community, only to find out it wasn't approved and there were no funds, but they had already given their support. Now, the one that is fundamentally important also is that we're paying back currently on the LA Inc. contract like $2 million a year for 10 years or something like that, because that's money that we should be getting in our general fund for services that we're providing. You're not paying us because we have to pay you back $20 million. Those are the kind of instances that are general fund impact that this motion came about to say we don't need to keep walking down this path because FAA is the final decider, and if they don't agree and we spend our money, the general fund's going to pay back the airport. And that's what we're trying to prevent. And I can't remember, we've had at least one, maybe two similar incidents with the harbor. And I think there is a Tidewater,
State Tidelands Trust.
Tideland, that we ended up having to pay back because we did similar issues. And the reason that I thought it was important to have a policy is that we know that there is tremendous pressure exerted on the proprietary departments when somebody wants to get something done. And sometimes, and that was the issue of the job training program, that I don't think people at the time wanted to hear what LAWA had to say or whether there was some caution. It was just put it in the plan, we will get these community people to support it, and we'll worry about it later. And later came out that all these people then looked at us and said, where's that job training money? He said that job training money wasn't approved from the beginning. It was just smoke. And so that's what we wanted to make sure. And we were told a year ago that you were working on some wording as a department response, and that would be important. We wanted, as this motion, just have that as part of our financial guidelines in general for the city, that we say if there's a higher authority that has to approve something, we should probably get at least some approval before we start using that very defined source of money at the airport and the harbor and use it in a fashion that will cost an impact to the general fund. So that's what we're fine. Let the department have a policy, we have a financial policy.
On that note, Mr. Parks raised this issue through the process we went through that we were concerned about, especially LA. What are you thinking about presenting to the Board of Airport Commissioners?
Basically, what we had prepared for our managers, for Law's executive management, and that now that the management has agreed to consider taking that to the board, is basically a checklist of what steps you go through when confronted with a new project agreement, what have you, that would delineate the steps that the staff and management would use to determine whether or not something is compliant with FAA policy. I mean, obviously, it might be different in the case of the Harbor and the Tidelands Act or something like that, but it was basically sort of like a 1 or 2 page checklist of sort of summarizing how you tell whether or not it would comply with the regulations. So you don't have to keep going back to the regulations and reading that the CFR in detail like that.
Yeah, the important thing from my end is, as you well know, we don't want to be held up on anything we're doing that's part of our modernization, part of our community involvement, that we are now giving the FAA more opportunity than I would like to give them, and in certain circumstances, knowing how bureaucracies work, things could make things a little more difficult, in some cases impossible. That, talk about a bureaucracy, the FAA's got its own set of circumstances. I don't want to, and have we had any discussions with the FAA of how we see them going forward after Mr. Parks' motion?
The thing about the process we're setting up here is that we're not looking at it as necessarily FAA pre-approval of everything, because that would be burdensome. But what we're doing is identifying potential areas that are gray areas, and looking at increasing the scrutiny of those. And for some, it's not necessarily where we'd go to the FAA for pre-approval, but we could go to, say, outside counsel and who is familiar with the FAA funding regulations to get their opinion or something. Yeah. For routine matters, we don't want our policy to hold up approval of what we consider to be routine items. But for things that are a little more questionable, like we did with the jobs program, and like we've done with property transfers, when people want us to sell excess property, we'll take that to FAA and say, would this be an approvable project? And there are certain things that we do ask the FAA for approval for, but we try to keep those numbers down because, as you said, the FAA approval process is cumbersome and lengthy and not always consistent.
Right. And with that as a backdrop, what you'll take before your board will be conceptual places or specific areas, or how do you define how you want the FAA involved in it or not? And I'm glad you suggest it goes to the board, and I will certainly recommend the healthy discussion of the board first before council takes action.
What the board would be approving is a document that says the steps that staff will go through to determine whether or not something is expected to be in compliance.
Right.
And if it's not expected to be in compliance, then we would go to the FAA. But it would basically be a procedural document for staff that then would be on the record and be consistent throughout the department, and that would be the purpose of it. It wouldn't be the FAA approval would be, seeking FAA approval of a project would be sort of the last resort for a gray area type project, I guess you could say.
Mr. Parks, how does that go with where you see this?
I think he's right on. The thing is that I don't recall in my history that LAWA has misspent their money. It's only when we ask them to misspend their money that they get in trouble. That's when they get in trouble. So the thing is, we're trying to put something in place that says, when you ask something that doesn't appear right, go look into it a little more in depth.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody comes up with a great idea about a job training program, go look at it before you say we're going to spend $15 million. If somebody says LA Inc. would be a great thing to spend your money on, and it's going to do A, B, and C, figure that out before you give them $20 million and we got to pay it back. They have never had they understand the rules. It's the folks that impose on them additional rules. That's what we're trying to say.
Well, I need the comfort level of Gina Marie and you, and obviously of the board, that we're going in the right direction. I don't want to put any obstacles that become frustrating for us, that delay things further in issues where maybe we should have exerted more clarity in where we're going. That's just my concern.
Absolutely, and I think Gina Marie would agree with you. I spoke with her about this morning, and then her agreement that we take this to the board. I think it's consistent with trying to make sure we're in compliance with the FAA policies and regulations, but not holding up anything unnecessarily. Yeah.
On their construction plan, I don't think there's much in that plan that FAA wouldn't approve. And they're not spending the money any place other than on the airport. It's when you kind of start drifting off the airport is when it becomes an issue. And that's what and generally it's not their idea. It's a funded also idea.
Yeah. Okay, just so you know, it's very important to me that the commission and your leadership there see this as a plus, not in any way as an encumbrance that could create more issues for us. And that comfort level is what I was hearing from folks in the community who said the last thing we wanted to do was give the FAA more opportunity to make things difficult for us at LAX. That was somebody's random comment. And then another one used as an example. For instance, if we needed to send out a city building inspector to inspect new construction at LAWA, would we first need to get the FAA approval? That might add on months, if not years, or simply a task of inspecting a building. That's when somebody got down in the weeds and said, could it mean this, could it mean that, and their understanding of it. And your answers to both those questions?
Well, to the second one, that would be an example of a routine task that we're doing all the time. And that one, because one of the checklist items, if you will, that we're looking at is precedent. What have we done historically? I mean, if obviously it's something we've been doing for years and years and years, having city building inspectors come out, paying the city building inspector to come out and inspect the building.
Right.
We've been doing that for years. FAA hasn't said anything. That's a very key component to continuing that service.
Right. So we want to worry about, I don't want to have an overreaching reality. And then the last point somebody mentioned to me, that the issues we were talking about, especially LA Inc., they've been resolved and there are new protections in place at LAWA to prevent this from happening again. Is that true?
Oh, yes. Our new LA Inc. contract is scaled back quite a bit from the one that we got dinged over.
Right.
And I think at this point in time, the LA Inc. contract is very clear about what they will work on and what they won't work on.
Right.
And so the problem areas of the past are not covered anymore, and we're not paying them to do that, and they're not doing that on our nickel.
Right. So do you feel comfortable about Mr. Park's motion is something that gives you enough flexibility and breadth that you can take it to your board and refine it more and then bring it back to us? Or what do you see procedurally from your
Again, I think we're comfortable taking a procedure to our board for approval. I just say FAA pre-approval of everything. We'll address FAA approval as necessary in our policy. I just think for the routine items, our policy will not address that as an FAA pre-approval item, but for things like the jobs training program, LA Inc. contract, things that might be new or different, those are the areas where we're going to have to look more closely at under the magnifying glass and deal with FAA. So I think we can come up with a policy using Mr. Parks' motion as a guideline. We'll come up with a policy I think that works well for us.
Okay, as long as you feel that way, I can support this. I just did not want to throw any more obstacles in our way of modernization and the way we run that airport.
Absolutely.
By giving the FAA a bureaucracy that is distant and local, obviously, more time to be engaged in something that might cause us problems on timetables and situations.
I think we're fine.
Well, this is not exactly my area of expertise. I haven't done a lot with the airports, but I think I recognize that if we have a major project, we go forward with it, and then the FAA dings us, that could be very costly. Now, in the staff report, it says getting pre-approval from the FAA would be difficult. So my question is, are we literally looking for pre-approval, or are we just saying if you have a complicated, expensive process, we should be touching base with the FAA as things go along to make sure we're not going down the right path and don't get surprised after we've implemented a project.
Depends on a number of factors. Obviously, precedent has a large role to play. As I said, precedent has a large role to play, and the size of the project obviously is a role to play. Whether or not we consult with the FAA will depend on a number of factors, but it won't be in each and every case, because that would be, I think, too cumbersome.
Right. I think my sense is we're talking about projects like this $15 million job training program. You know, something of great substance and not routine, and where we have some concern that they might ding us on the project. So are you expecting to literally try to get pre-approval, or are you expecting to just work with them along the way as the project's being developed to make sure we don't get there and they just say, no, you're completely off base?
It's going to depend on the project, because some projects, because it might really look like it's, if a proposed project really has a significant disconnect from what we think would be allowable under the funding regulations, we might ask the FAA to approve it in advance. On the other hand, if something were kind of just perhaps a little bit in the gray area, we might just consult with the FAA, but not ask for any sort of formal documentation from them. I mean, like I said, it'll depend on the nature of the project.
Well, it sounds like a good approach to make sure we're touching base with them in an appropriate way where we might be concerned that a project might go forward and then not be approved by them. But so I guess whatever makes sense for you to do this as a practical matter makes sense to me. So it sounds like we're going down the right path.
Let me just ask, have we made any headway with the Harbor Department on this issue?
When we spoke with them, we had some preliminary discussions last year, and they were willing to draft some kind of policy, but they wanted to wait to see what airports was going to propose, and they thought that they would draft something along similar lines.
All right, very good. Let me just say we'll move this, but let me change the recommendation number 1 that is proposed by the CAO, and ask the CAO to work with LAWA and Harbor so that they can create their internal policies that go before their board as relates to addressing these unique funding opportunities. And then once those are approved by the board, that we can then bring them to Budget and Finance so that we can view them potentially to adopt as city policies in our financial policies.
Okay.
And that will, I think, put us on good footing.
Okay.
And so then, I don't think you'll get that done in 60 days. So
What do you think?
what do we think on time?
We'll aim for 60 days. I'm not sure how much time the
Let's
department.
just say you can give us an update in 60 days on the progress.
We've obviously done some groundwork on this at our department. I can't speak for Harbor, obviously, but I think, I'll talk to 60, 90 days as a target might not be a bad
And if
idea.
you could work with Harbor to share with them with what you're doing.
Absolutely.
You're hitting right where we need to hit. We have no intent of slowing you down. It's just when we have these unique requests, we need to give you some protection.
And again, from my perspective.
Absolutely.
So if there's any issues as we develop this that suggest this could have some of these effects that some people were suggesting, please let us know that.
Absolutely.
No way do I want to hamstrung projects that we clearly understand, approve, and know the consequences of. It's just those that obviously set us off when LA Inc. was in that situation it was in. You now have protectors in place. I don't want to make anything more cumbersome for us in dealing with the FAA than it already is in some issues. So you'll keep me posted.
That's our intent, yes.
Or we come up with
Yes,
But as Mr. Parks was saying, you'll do a report back that will be an update. That's cool.
And then you said we amended this, May 2010, when we added the Harbor?
May 17 was introduced 2010. May 17, 2020.
All right, so we'll move that with those instructions. Thank you. We have no cards, and so we're adjourned.